what was meant to be a celebration of love, a beginning of a life shared forever, ended in a nightmare no one could have prepared for. In the blink of an eye, the happiest day of Sarah Miller's life unraveled, exposing a betrayal so deep it would send shockwaves through her family. Her wedding night, once filled with dreams of hope and promise, would instead be marked as the darkest night of her existence. She had everything: love, a promising future, a picture-perfect life. But the secrets, hidden beneath the surface, were far more dangerous than anyone could have imagined. A secret so devastating, so earth-shattering, that it would leave her questioning everything she thought she knew about the people closest to her. Sarah had no idea that on that night, the man she had married, the man who swore to love and cherish her, had already given his heart to someone else. But the shock would not end there. For Sarah, the truth was about to hit like a freight train, not just with betrayal, but with an unforgivable sin, one that cut deeper than she could ever have imagined. What followed was an unraveling of emotions, trust shattered beyond repair, and a crime so brutal it would haunt those who witnessed it for years to come. A crime that not only tore apart a family, but sent shockwaves through a community that had once viewed them as the perfect, untouchable family. Sarah Miller discovered that her husband Ethan had not only betrayed her trust, he had betrayed her with someone far closer to her than she could have ever dreamed, her own sister, Rachel. And in the moments that followed, a violence far beyond anyone's expectation would leave a family torn apart and a life forever altered. This is not just a story of betrayal. It is a story of love turned into rage, of family bonds crushed under the weight of deception, and a tragic ending that no one saw coming. This is the chilling tale of Sarah Miller, her wedding night, her sister, and a murder that left everyone wondering, how could something so perfect go so terribly wrong? Stay with us as we investigate the tragic events that followed that fateful night, the moments that led to a brutal act, and the investigation that would leave more questions than answers. This is the story that stunned a community, shattered a family, and forever changed the lives of everyone involved. Behind every wedding is a story of love, family, and hope for the future. But for Sarah Miller, that story would take an unimaginable turn, a turn that no one in her world could have predicted. To understand how the perfect life can so quickly fall apart, we must first look at the characters who played their roles in this tragedy. A wife, a husband, and a sister, all bound by ties of love and loyalty that would soon be shattered forever. Sarah Miller was, by all accounts, the picture of grace and intelligence. A woman with dreams of building a family, with a heart full of love and a mind full of ambition. She was the type of person who saw the best in everyone, who gave herself completely to the people she loved. Her life, as she saw it, was on the verge of something beautiful. The man she had chosen to marry, Ethan, was a charming, well-liked man, someone everyone admired for his charisma and easy smile. Together, they made the perfect couple. To the world, their union was the culmination of everything they had worked for. They were a power couple. He, a successful businessman, she, a dedicated woman with a heart for family. Their wedding day was meant to be the ultimate celebration of their love. But behind Ethan's easy smile was a man who had long carried secrets. Secrets he had buried so deep, he thought no one could uncover them. He had been Sarah's partner, her love, but to her, He was hiding something far more dangerous than she could ever have imagined. And in the shadows of their seemingly perfect relationship was someone even closer to Sarah than her husband, the woman who had once been her best friend, her confidant, her sister. Rachel Miller, Sarah's younger sister, had always been an enigma. On the surface, she was warm, kind, and often the life of the party. But beneath that surface was a complexity few understood. She had always struggled with feelings of inadequacy, battling her own demons of jealousy, longing, and a hunger for affection that seemed to consume her. While Sarah had her perfect life, Rachel felt invisible, often overlooked in the glow of her older sister's success. But no one knew just how deep Rachel's envy went, and no one could have imagined the devastating consequences of her actions. Leading up to the wedding day, the Millers, Sarah, Ethan, and Rachel, were like any other close-knit family. They shared holidays, family gatherings, and, of course, their dreams. They had been through ups and downs together, but no one could have guessed that those bonds would soon be tested in the most unimaginable way. As Sarah prepared for her wedding, she was surrounded by the warmth of her family. The woman who had always been by her side, Rachel, and the man she was about to marry, Ethan. But the cracks beneath the surface were there, even if no one could see them yet. The night before the wedding, everything appeared perfect. Ethan, despite his inner turmoil, was the loving fiancé, giving Sarah every reason to believe she had found her soulmate. Rachel, too, appeared to be her supportive, fun-loving sister, but this image of a tight-knit family, happy, carefree, and secure, was just that, an image, a mask they all wore, concealing the darkness beneath. What Sarah didn't know, what none of them could know, was that the love she thought she had in her life was based on lies, and the very person she trusted the most, the one she called family, had betrayed her in the most unimaginable way. This wasn't just about a wedding. This was about secrets that had been buried for too long, about a family that had come to rely on falsehoods, and about a night that would expose everything. For Sarah, it was the beginning of the end. What seemed like a perfect day surrounded by love and happiness would soon turn into a devastating revelation that no one was prepared for. And as the evening unfolded, the truths would come to light. Truths that would destroy the fragile bonds that held them together. The wedding night, meant to be the start of their journey as husband and wife, would become the scene of a brutal betrayal, one that would shatter the illusions of love and trust Sarah had once cherished. As Sarah stood before her mirror, dressed in white, her heart full of love and hope for the future, she had no idea that within hours her life would be torn apart. The love she thought was true would be replaced by anger, heartbreak, and a betrayal so cruel that it would send her on a path no one could have ever expected. It was the day that Sarah Miller had dreamed of for years. The kind of day every woman imagines from the moment she first begins to imagine her future. The sun was shining, the flowers were in full bloom, and the air was filled with the promise of love and celebration. The perfect wedding day, the kind of day that would begin the next chapter of a life built on hope, joy, and family. The guests had arrived, all smiles and laughter. The church was filled with the sounds of excited chatter, the rustling of dresses, and the nervous energy of loved ones who had gathered to witness a union that everyone believed was meant to last. Sarah stood before the mirror, adjusting her veil, the woman who had everything she could have wanted, her family, her future, her love. Beside her, her sister Rachel helped her adjust her dress, offering soft words of encouragement, her face bright with the joy of the day. Sarah looked at Rachel, seeing the familiar face of the sister who had stood by her side through so much. She smiled, grateful for her support. The bond between them was unspoken, one forged in shared memories, family moments, and the quiet, intimate understanding only siblings could have. But if Sarah had looked just a little closer, if she had paid more attention to the subtle changes in Rachel's demeanor, perhaps she might have seen the tension hiding behind her sister's smile. Rachel wasn't just the supportive sister she appeared to be. There was something deeper, something that Sarah couldn't quite place, lingering just beneath the surface. The ceremony began. The aisle was lined with flowers, and the air was thick with the scent of romance. Ethan stood at the altar, handsome in his tuxedo, waiting for Sarah to walk down the aisle. His heart raced, his face a mask of calm. To everyone, he was the perfect groom, the man of Sarah's dreams. But as she walked toward him, her eyes locked with his, and for just a moment, there was something else in his gaze. It was fleeting, almost unnoticeable, but for Sarah, it was a small crack in the otherwise perfect image. They exchanged vows in front of their loved ones, words that were meant to last forever. Ethan promised to love, honor, and cherish Sarah. Sarah vowed the same. There were tears, smiles, and a kiss that sealed their vows. The guests cheered, and for a few moments everything seemed as it should. The celebration continued with music, dancing, and laughter. It was the perfect wedding, a storybook ending to the beginning of their new life together. But as the day wore on, something shifted. It was subtle, almost imperceptible to those around them, but the tension between Ethan and Rachel could not be ignored. From the corner of Sarah's eye, she could see the way Rachel would glance at Ethan, the way their gazes would briefly lock, almost as though they were communicating without words. It was the kind of thing you might brush off as nothing, just a passing moment. But when you know someone as well as Sarah knew her sister, you start to wonder if there's more to the story. But Sarah was distracted. After all, it was her wedding day. Who would think that something so dark, so terrible, could hide in plain sight? As the night drew near and the guests began to depart, the celebrations continued at the reception. The newlyweds shared their first dance, their smiles radiant. But there was something about the way Rachel hovered near Ethan, her eyes lingering on him just a little too long, that Sarah couldn't shake. She dismissed it, assuming it was just her mind playing tricks on her, the result of a long and emotional day. The night progressed with speeches, laughter, and champagne toasts. But as the clock ticked closer to midnight, the festive mood began to take a turn. A strange tension hung in the air, barely noticeable to anyone else, but all too clear to those who knew what to look for. The once joyful atmosphere began to feel heavier, almost suffocating. And as Sarah and Ethan made their way toward the door, ready to leave for their honeymoon, the unspoken tension reached its peak. In the midst of the final goodbyes and the fluttering excitement of the evening's end, Sarah excused herself to freshen up before they departed. She made her way to the bathroom, taking a moment to herself, to breathe, to reflect on the whirlwind of emotion she had experienced that day. She didn't know it yet, but this quiet moment of solitude would be the last before everything she knew came crashing down. As Sarah stood in front of the mirror, adjusting her makeup and taking a deep breath, she heard a faint sound, a whisper. It came from the hallway outside the bathroom door. She couldn't make out the words, but she knew who the voices belonged to. It was Ethan. It was Rachel. And for the first time that day, a cold shiver ran down her spine. What she didn't know was that the conversation she was about to overhear would expose everything. The illusion of her perfect day, her perfect life, would begin to unravel in that moment. What was supposed to be the happiest night of her life, the beginning of a lifetime of love, was about to turn into a nightmare. In that quiet, private moment, Sarah would come face to face with a truth so shocking, so unfathomable, it would change everything. And as the clock ticked on, what should have been a honeymoon night of bliss would become the night that revealed the darkest secret of all. For a moment, Sarah froze. She wasn't sure why she was so unsettled, but her instincts told her that something wasn't right. The uneasy feeling in the pit of her stomach deepened, and as the whispering continued, her mind raced. Was she overreacting? Maybe they were just talking. After all, they were siblings, close like family. But something in the way they spoke, the hushed intensity, sent a shiver down her spine. What were they saying? Why did they sound so secretive? Could it really be something as innocent as she thought? Or was it something far darker, something she wasn't prepared to face? She stood there, caught in the quiet thrum of her own heartbeat. What was it that made her feel this way? Was she imagining things? No, Sarah knew herself too well. She could feel the tension building like a storm cloud gathering in the distance. Her fingers, still resting on the edge of the vanity, trembled slightly. Was she being paranoid? Or was there something lurking beneath the surface, something hidden in the space between the words, the silent glances exchanged? Why did the atmosphere feel so charged, so full of unspoken things? Should she just walk away, pretend she hadn't heard anything? Could she really let this moment go unnoticed? But what if this moment was the key to something much bigger, something that could unravel everything she thought she knew? Without realizing it, Sarah moved toward the door. Her feet seemed to carry her, a force of nature she couldn't resist, drawn by the magnetic pull of the unknown. What was she going to find? What truths would come spilling out of the cracks in her perfect life? As she reached the door, every part of her body screamed for her to stop, but she couldn't. The moment was too thick, too heavy with questions, and all Sarah could do was step closer, inching toward the truth she didn't want to know. Why was her heart pounding? Why did her gut twist in such a way that she couldn't ignore it? Was this the reality of her life coming to meet her? Or was she about to step into a nightmare she couldn't wake from? She reached for the doorknob, her breath catching in her throat as she slowly turned it. And then, there they were, Ethan and Rachel, standing so close their bodies almost touching. What was she seeing? Was this real, or had her mind finally betrayed her too, making her see things that weren't there? Their voices were hushed now, barely a murmur, but Sarah could hear them. Her name was being whispered between them. Ethan's voice, so tender, so intimate, Rachel's laughter, low and soft. What did that sound mean? Was she just hearing things, or was there a secret they were sharing? And if so, why had they been hiding it from her? 100 questions spiraled through Sarah's mind, each more painful than the last. Why had they kept this from her? How had they pulled this off right under her nose? Did she mean so little to them? Was everything she thought she knew about her marriage a lie? And then As if to answer her unspoken question, Rachel stepped closer to Ethan, her hand resting gently on his arm. Was it a friendly touch or something more? Something that crossed the line? Could it be possible that the person she trusted most in the world was standing there, touching the man who had promised to love her forever? What was it that kept them so close? The chemistry between them was undeniable, and in that moment, it hit Sarah like a physical blow. It was more than just a bond of siblings. This was something else, something that should never have existed. What had she missed? What had she ignored in her blissful ignorance? Ethan turned first. His eyes met hers, wide with guilt, shock, and something else. Was it fear? Or had he been caught in a web of his own making, tangled in a lie so deep he couldn't see the way out? Rachel, on the other hand, was frozen in place. Her face drained of color. She knew the moment Sarah stepped into the hallway, everything they had tried to protect was shattered. What was she going to say? What could she possibly say to explain this betrayal? Could anything explain this? Sarah couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. All she could do was stand there, staring at them, the world collapsing in on itself. Why was this happening to her? Why did she deserve this betrayal from the two people she loved most in the world? And what did it all mean? What was the truth behind this moment? And then finally, Ethan spoke. His voice was low, tinged with desperation. "Sarah, we need to talk." But Sarah wasn't sure she could trust him anymore. What could he say that would change this? Could he explain away the look in Rachel's eyes? Could he erase the touch between them, the whispered words shared in private? Was there any way back from this moment? Rachel opened her mouth to speak, but her words faltered. She took a step toward Sarah, but it wasn't comfort that filled her gaze. It was something else. Was it shame? Regret? Did she even understand what she had done? Or was she too tangled in her own lies to see the truth? Could Sarah ever forgive her? The questions kept coming, relentless, unyielding, and Sarah, standing there in the hallway, felt the full weight of them pressed down on her. Was this the end of her marriage? Was this the beginning of the end for everything she thought she knew? In that moment, the world seemed to stand still. Sarah's heart raced, but she couldn't feel it. It was as if her body was floating outside of herself, watching the scene unfold, unable to comprehend what had just happened. Was this real? Was this truly happening? Or had she slipped into some kind of nightmare that she couldn't wake up from? The voices from the hallway grew louder, Ethan's, Rachel's, and the words, though hushed, seemed to carry a weight that made Sarah's blood run cold. Every word they spoke felt like a razor slicing through her skin. It wasn't just the betrayal in the air, it was what they were betraying her with, something far more intimate, far more irreversible. "How long have you been—" Sarah wanted to scream, but the words caught in her throat. How could she even ask the question? The very thought felt like an impossible accusation, yet she already knew. She already felt it in her bones. The silence that followed was thick, suffocating. She could hear them talking, but the meaning of their words hadn't hit her yet, not fully. Her hands were shaking as she turned to face the mirror, her reflection barely recognizable. Was it the wedding dress that made her look like someone else? Or was it the horror that had suddenly shattered her world, that had turned everything she thought she knew into a twisted, broken illusion? Then it came. One single devastating sentence that pierced through the suffocating silence like a bullet. She's pregnant. The words hung in the air like poison, and for a long moment Sarah couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't move. The reality of it all was too much to bear. Pregnant. Rachel, her sister, the woman who had been her best friend, her confidant, the one person she'd trusted most in the world, was carrying her husband's child. "You've got to be kidding me," Sarah whispered, her voice raw and ragged. But the words, as much as she hoped they were a nightmare, weren't. They were real. Too real. For a moment, Sarah stood there, frozen, like the entire world had stopped spinning. The woman in the mirror was a stranger, her face pale, her eyes wide with disbelief, her hands trembling. Was she dreaming? Was this some kind of twisted joke? But no, it wasn't. It was her reality now. The husband she had just married, the man she had given everything to, had not only betrayed her, but he had done so in the worst way possible. How long had it been going on? Was it before the wedding? During their engagement? Was this all a lie? Was their entire relationship just a facade to cover up something darker? Her mind reeled as she stumbled backward, gripping the edge of the vanity to steady herself. But no matter how much she tried to convince herself this wasn't happening, the pain in her chest was undeniable. It was a raw, gnawing ache that spread through her, making her feel like she was suffocating under the weight of it all. Pregnant. Rachel, her sister. The words echoed in her mind, each repetition feeling like a blade twisting deeper into her heart. She didn't know what to do, didn't know where to go. The wedding night, their wedding night, had been ripped from her, shattered into pieces. What had been a dream, a future she had built in her mind, was now a nightmare she couldn't escape. She tried to gather herself, but the reality kept crashing over her like waves in an unrelenting storm. Then, as if pulled by some invisible force, Sarah turned and walked out of the bathroom. Her wedding dress swished around her ankles, a reminder of a life that no longer made sense. She couldn't face Ethan, not yet. Not with this truth hanging between them, suffocating every ounce of trust they had ever shared. In a daze, she stumbled into the hallway. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to get away from them, from him. She had to be alone, away from the suffocating confines of the night, away from the wedding that had promised her a future, a love she thought was unshakable. But as Sarah stepped out of the room, as she pushed open the door that led to the cold night air, a gut-wrenching sob tore from her chest. The shock, the heartbreak, the disbelief, it all collided in that one moment, and she couldn't hold it in any longer. She didn't know how long she walked for. All she knew was that she couldn't go back. Not to that hotel room, not to Ethan, not to Rachel, not when everything she had ever believed had been ripped away from her in one heart-shattering moment. With every step, she distanced herself from the truth she had just uncovered. But no matter how far she walked, no matter how hard she tried to outrun it, Sarah knew one thing for sure. Her life would never be the same, and nothing, not even time, could ever undo the damage that had been done. But as Sarah wandered aimlessly through the streets, heartbroken and alone, she had no idea that this night, the night she had believed would mark the start of a beautiful life, was only the beginning of a tragedy that would bring the very foundation of her world crumbling down. What would come next would be a revelation so devastating, so unexpected, that no one, not even Sarah, could have ever seen it coming. But for now, the dark truth had settled into her soul, leaving behind a void too deep to fill. She had been betrayed in the most unimaginable way possible, and the consequences of that betrayal were just beginning to unfold. What Sarah didn't know, what none of them could have imagined, was that the night, already filled with betrayal, was about to take an even darker turn. It was only a matter of time before the simmering tensions between the three of them, Ethan, Rachel, and Sarah, would explode into something far more violent than anyone could have predicted. As Sarah wandered the streets, her thoughts a tangled mess of disbelief and rage. Back at the hotel, the air was thick with anger. Ethan paced back and forth in their suite, his mind racing, heart pounding in his chest. What had he done? How had everything gone so terribly wrong? He knew he had to fix it, but there was no easy way out, no way to undo the damage he'd caused. Rachel, on the other hand, sat on the edge of the bed, her face blank, her eyes vacant. She had always been the one to take control in any situation, but now her world felt as shattered as Sarah's. What they had done could never be undone, and deep down, a cold, suffocating guilt gnawed at her. But it wasn't just guilt, it was fear. Fear of the consequences, fear of the one person who could ruin it all. Sarah. She had to confront her sister. She had to explain herself, or everything would fall apart. And Rachel couldn't bear the thought of losing Ethan. Not now, not after everything. But things were no longer in their control. The fragile thread that had once held them together was fraying, and the tension was about to snap. What was supposed to be a wedding night had now turned into something far more tragic, something no one could have foreseen. Back in the suite, Ethan's nerves were raw, and his thoughts were jumbled. He had tried to call Sarah several times, but she hadn't answered. He couldn't bear the thought of facing her. Not yet. But Rachel, she was pushing him to confront her, to face the music. "We need to fix this," Rachel insisted, her voice sharp with urgency. "We need to get ahead of this before it all comes crashing down." But as Ethan looked at Rachel, something inside him snapped. Maybe it was the guilt eating at him. Maybe it was the weight of what he had done, pressing down on him like a vice. But in that moment, something darker, something he couldn't explain, overtook him, something violent. He turned to Rachel, his eyes wild, his voice shaking. "You didn't tell me. You lied to me, Rachel. I trusted you. I trusted you." Rachel recoiled, her face pale. "I never wanted this to happen," she whispered, her voice a mixture of anger and regret. "But you were supposed to be my sister's husband. You were supposed to be faithful to her, Ethan. How could we let this go on?" And there it was, the truth spilling out between them. The months of deception, the shared lies, the twisted love triangle that had festered in the shadows. In that room, the truth had become a weapon, cutting through the fragile remnants of their relationship. But it wasn't just the truth that threatened to destroy them. It was their own insecurities, their guilt, their mounting fear that they could never undo what had been done. And in that raw, heated moment, as the silence stretched between them, the tension reached its breaking point. It happened quickly, too quickly. One moment they were arguing. The next, Ethan's hand shot out, gripping Rachel's arm tightly. His face twisted with rage, his breath coming in short, sharp bursts. Rachel gasped, trying to free herself, but it was too late. The violence was already there in his eyes, in the way his fingers dug into her skin, in the way the air seemed to crackle with energy. "You should never have come into my life," Ethan spat, his voice low, dangerous. This was a mistake, all of it." And then, in an instant, it escalated further, a shove, a stumble, and Rachel, off balance, crashed into the corner of the nightstand. There was a sickening thud, and for a moment, everything seemed to freeze, frozen in time, the horror of the situation too much to fully comprehend. Rachel let out a soft cry, her eyes wide, blinking in confusion. She tried to push herself up, but the blood, so much blood, was pouring from the gash on her forehead, staining the white sheets and her hands. She tried to speak, but all that came out was a choked gasp. And just like that, in the blink of an eye, everything changed. What had started as a wedding night full of hope had turned into a violent, brutal tragedy. Rachel was gone, just like that. Ethan stood there, his chest heaving, the horror of what he had just done crashing down on him with the force of a tidal wave. His hands were shaking, his mind a blur. What had he done? What had he done? The room was silent except for the sound of his breath, ragged and uneven. The walls seemed to close in around him as he stared at Rachel's still body on the floor. The reality of the moment settled in like concrete, heavy and suffocating. He had just killed his sister-in-law, his wife's sister. The life they had been building was gone, destroyed in an instant. And in that moment, as Ethan stood in the wreckage of what he had done, he knew nothing would ever be the same again. The world outside that room would never know what had happened within those four walls. And Sarah would never understand the depths of what had unfolded that night. She would never be able to piece together the violence, the destruction, the loss, the pain. For now, the night remained eerily quiet, save for the distant sound of Ethan's sobs as he collapsed to his knees, staring at the sister he had just taken from the world. But this was only the beginning of the consequences that would unfold in the days to come. The murder of Rachel would send shock waves through the family, through the town, and through every single life that had been touched by this tragedy. In the aftermath, Ethan would have to confront the truth, the guilt, and the fact that the horror he had caused could never be undone. But for now, one thing was clear. The night had claimed its first victim, and nothing would ever be the same again. Inside the suite, the atmosphere had shifted from one of secret passion to something far darker. Ethan stood over Rachel's lifeless body, his mind racing. His heart pounded in his chest, but it felt like it wasn't his own. He could barely breathe, let alone think clearly. The reality of what he had just done was crashing down on him, but he couldn't stop the adrenaline-fueled panic that was rising in his chest. Rachel, her once beautiful face, now a mask of shock and stillness, lay at his feet, the consequences of their twisted web of lies spilling out in a violent, irreversible way. The pregnancy, the affair, the betrayal. In the span of moments, everything had been destroyed. What had started as a secret indulgence, one he thought he could manage, had escalated into an unthinkable tragedy. Ethan stared down at her, his thoughts a whirlwind. Was this really happening? Had he really killed her? The weight of his actions was unbearable, but a cold, calculating part of him began to take over. He could feel the seconds ticking by, the walls closing in. He knew, deep down, that the police would be on their way. It was only a matter of time. His mind raced as he quickly assessed the room. The scene was clean, at least on the surface. No weapon, no obvious signs of a struggle, just the blood staining the floor. There was nothing that would tie him directly to the murder except for the truth, and the truth was a ticking time bomb. Ethan's instincts kicked in. He had to leave. He had to disappear before the police could link him to the crime. But where would he go? His marriage was over, his life ruined, but the only way to escape was to vanish. As his eyes scanned the room, he began to move in a frantic haze, grabbing his wallet, his phone. His mind was a blur, but his actions were decisive. He couldn't afford to stay in this room for much longer. The longer he lingered, the more likely he was to be caught. With his heart pounding, Ethan rushed to the door. His hand hovered over the handle as he paused for a moment to look back at Rachel's body. Her silence screamed louder than any accusation could, but he couldn't stay. He couldn't look back anymore. He had already crossed the line. As he stepped out into the hallway, he moved quickly but deliberately, trying to avoid drawing attention to himself. The hotel was busy with people still celebrating the wedding downstairs, oblivious to the tragedy unfolding just a few floors above. Ethan's mind was fixated on one thing: getting out of this place, out of this life, before the inevitable caught up to him. He knew he couldn't go home. He couldn't risk Sarah finding out what he had done. The guilt would be too much, the fear even more suffocating. No, he needed to disappear. The thought of being arrested, of being dragged through the courts, tore at him. He'd ruined everything, and now he had to vanish to avoid paying the price for his actions. The weight of his choices was too heavy, and the consequences far too devastating to face. But running was the only option. Ethan slipped through the back entrance of the hotel, blending in with a group of guests leaving the event. His movements hurried, but careful. He knew his window was closing, but his only hope lay in creating enough distance between himself and the crime scene before the police arrived. Time was his enemy, and every passing second was one step closer to his capture. Sarah had wandered the streets for hours, the cold night air biting at her skin, but she hardly felt it. Her mind had been too consumed by the storm of emotions that raged inside her. The heartbreak, the anger, the disbelief, it was all too much to process in one night. But as the minutes turned into hours, something inside her shifted. She couldn't keep running, couldn't stay out there forever in the dark of night. Her heart told her to go back, to face the reality she had been trying to avoid. She was no longer the bride who had just exchanged vows. She was a woman broken, shattered by betrayal, forced to confront the truth she never imagined possible. The wedding night that had promised so much had become a nightmare. And as she finally started to make her way back to the hotel, her every step felt like a battle against her own mind. When Sarah arrived back at the hotel, it felt different. The lobby was eerily quiet, and for a moment, she considered turning around and leaving once more. But she had unfinished business. Her belongings were still in the suite, and there was no escaping the reality of what had happened. No more running. The elevator ride was silent, the hum of the machinery echoing in the empty shaft. Sarah stood motionless, her thoughts racing with every floor it passed. As the doors opened, she stepped into the hallway. She had no idea what she was about to walk into. The suite door loomed before her, almost as if it was mocking her. Her fingers trembled as she turned the handle and pushed the door open. The room, once filled with celebration and joy, now felt cold and foreign. It smelled of stale air and something darker, something she couldn't quite place. And then she saw it. Her eyes locked onto the gruesome scene before her. Rachel's body sprawled lifeless on the floor, blood seeping into the carpet beneath her. The once vibrant woman who had been her sister was now nothing more than a cold, lifeless shell. The reality hit her like a punch to the stomach, and her breath caught in her throat. For a moment, Sarah couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. The blood, the overwhelming amount of it, told the story. The silence in the room screamed of death, and Sarah knew in her gut that Ethan was the one who had done this. She could feel it in her bones. Tears blurred her vision as she stumbled back, her heart slamming against her chest. Her scream broke the silence, echoing through the hotel corridor like a cry of pure agony. Hotel staff rushed to her side, their faces filled with shock and confusion, but Sarah barely noticed them. She could only stare at her sister's lifeless form, the horror of the situation settling in. Her world was no longer the same. The hotel staff scrambled for their phones, calling the police. The urgency in their voices only made the gravity of the situation more real. This was no longer just a marriage that had fallen apart. This was a crime scene. Someone was dead, and Ethan was nowhere to be found. As Sarah collapsed to the floor beside Rachel, the full weight of the betrayal hit her once more. Her sister, her flesh and blood, was gone. The man she had married, the man she had trusted, had destroyed everything. The evidence was clear, but now the question was, what had happened in those final moments between Ethan and Rachel? How had it all gone so horribly wrong? The hotel staff hovered, unsure what to do, until the first officers arrived. The police quickly took control of the situation. Hotel staff members, still in shock, were ushered out of the room as uniformed officers sealed off the suite. The once serene hotel, a backdrop for couples on romantic getaways, was now a crime scene, tainted by the brutality of an unthinkable act. The sterile yellow tape fluttered in the breeze, a silent testament to the twisted events that had unfolded within the walls of that luxurious suite. Detective Thomas, a seasoned investigator in his 40s, surveyed the scene. He was methodical, calm, and precise, a veteran who had seen countless cases like this. Yet, there was something about this one that unsettled him. The personal connections, the betrayal, and the chilling finality of the situation weighed on him. Still, he was determined to untangle the mystery that now surrounded the tragic death of Rachel. He stood near the doorway, observing Sarah, who was still kneeling beside her sister's body. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and unblinking. She had barely moved since the officers arrived. Her grief was palpable, but there was something else in her expression, something darker, more conflicted. The detective's gaze shifted between Sarah and the room. This wasn't a straightforward case. It wasn't just about a murder. It was about a shattered family, a broken marriage, and an unraveling web of secrets. The crime scene was carefully documented. Every inch of the suite was photographed, from the blood-stained carpet to the overturned furniture. The bloodstains, however, told a different story. The way they spread out across the floor suggested a violent altercation had taken place. There were no signs of a weapon, no bullet holes, no stab wounds. The blood seemed to indicate a beating or some form of blunt force trauma, but the lack of a weapon raised even more questions. Rachel's body was carefully examined by the forensics team, and the autopsy would eventually confirm what the investigators suspected. Rachel had died from blunt force trauma to the head. It was clear the violence had been personal, but what had sparked it? Was this an act of revenge or something even darker? Detective Thomas felt the weight of the case grow heavier. This wasn't just about uncovering the facts. It was about piecing together the shattered pieces of a once perfect life. And at the center of it all was Ethan. But where was he? By the time Sarah was questioned, Ethan was already missing. He had fled the hotel room, leaving behind a trail of unanswered questions. The police quickly learned that he had been seen leaving the building shortly after Rachel's body was discovered, but by then, he had vanished. The investigators knew that time was critical. If Ethan was attempting to flee the scene, it wouldn't take long before he crossed state lines or even borders. Detective Thomas knew this could turn into an international manhunt, and every second counted. They started with what they knew: Ethan's vehicle. The police immediately ran a check on his license plate number and began tracking his movements. Within hours, they had located his car parked near a bus terminal on the outskirts of town. He hadn't been seen boarding a plane, at least not yet. But he had purchased a one-way ticket to a city near the U.S.-Mexico border. This was no coincidence. The detective knew that Ethan was trying to escape, trying to flee to a place where he might be able to disappear. It wasn't long before Ethan's whereabouts became more clear. Authorities had accessed the hotel's security footage, capturing a blurry image of Ethan leaving the building. With this key piece of evidence, the police were able to confirm his route. He had made his way to the bus station, and from there, it was a simple matter of piecing together his movements. They reached out to authorities at the border, notifying them that Ethan was likely on his way to Mexico. The FBI, along with local law enforcement, was quickly alerted. Ethan was on the run, but he was about to realize how hard it would be to outrun justice. After several days of dead ends and frustration, a breakthrough finally came. A local informant in Tijuana, Mexico, had spotted Ethan in a small-town cafe near the border. He had been keeping a low profile, trying to blend in with the locals, but the manhunt was closing in on him. The Mexican authorities, working alongside U.S. Marshals, set up a covert operation to capture Ethan. They traced his steps from the cafe to a rented villa on the outskirts of the city. Ethan had spent several nights in the villa, but by the time authorities surrounded the area, he was cornered. Ethan's capture came without a struggle. When the police stormed the villa, he was found sitting alone in a dimly lit room, staring at the floor. The man who had once been so confident, so composed, was now broken. He knew his time had run out. There was nowhere left to hide. The arrest was quick, and Ethan was transported back to the United States. As he sat in the interrogation room, facing the detectives who had worked tirelessly to track him down, his silence spoke volumes. "I didn't mean for this to happen," Ethan muttered, his voice hoarse and defeated. "It wasn't supposed to be like this." Detective Thomas, now sitting across from him, leaned forward. "Tell me what happened, Ethan. Walk me through it." And so Ethan began to speak. His words came slowly, the confession a mix of regret, fear, and a desire to justify his actions. He explained how the argument between him and Rachel had escalated. He had never intended to kill her. It had been a mistake, an uncontrollable burst of rage. One moment, he was shouting at her, trying to convince her to end the affair and leave Sarah. The next moment, his hands were around her throat. It had happened so quickly, and then, when he realized what he had done, it was too late. Rachel was dead. "I didn't mean to kill her," Ethan repeated. "It just happened. I lost control. Ethan's confession was pivotal, but it wasn't the end of the story. His trial was a media sensation, drawing attention from both local and national outlets. Sarah, who had once been the wife of the man now sitting in the defendant's chair, found herself thrust into the spotlight. She had to relive the horror of discovering Rachel's body and the brutal betrayal of the man she had once loved. The prosecution was clear in their charge: second-degree murder. The defense, however, argued that it had been a crime of passion, the result of intense emotional turmoil. It didn't matter. The facts were clear. Ethan had killed Rachel, and the justice system was determined to hold him accountable. The trial lasted several weeks, with the emotional weight of the case evident in every testimony. When the verdict finally came, it was no surprise. Ethan was found guilty of second-degree murder and sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. For Sarah, the trial was the end of a long and painful chapter. She would never reconcile with Ethan, her husband, her betrayer. The grief she carried was a constant weight, and though justice had been served, there was no comfort to be found. In the end, justice had been served, but it came at a devastating cost. The bonds of love and family had been shattered, and the lives of all involved would never be the same. But perhaps the most chilling question, the one that would linger long after the trial had ended and the prison doors had closed behind Ethan, was this: how well do we truly know the ones we love? For more shocking crime stories, subscribe to our channel and click the notification bell. You won't want to miss the next episode, where we dive deeper into the twisted web of lies and deceit that destroyed a family. Stay tuned.